see that Saul is riddled with fear all throughout, from the time that he was chosen as king, all throughout until ultimately to the time of his death, where we see him operating and acting out of fear, fear of David taking over, fear of the Philistines, fear of the people. There are many things that he was afraid of. Now, so we're going to go ahead and start with number 4, which is fear. We see again that Saul was afraid of the Philistines. Even when they started the battle and Goliath came, Saul was afraid. He wouldn't go and attack. He wouldn't do the things that he needed to do. He didn't trust God that would take care of the situation. He was afraid because he saw the size of their army and they saw the size of his army. Now, again, we see in 1 Samuel 13, where we see his military army moves from 3,000 people, we move down to 600 people. One of the things that helped him kind of jump into the business that he had no business doing was because he said that he saw that the people were scattered from him. And he even said that to Samuel when Samuel said, why did you do this? And Saul's response is, when I saw that the people were scattered from me and that you did not come within the days appointed, which again Samuel did, and the Philistines had gathered, then I thought they were going to be coming. So I went ahead and I felt compelled and offered a burnt offering. Again, I was afraid of what was going to happen there. Oddly, that fear of the Philistines were the ones that ended up killing him. And we find that many times the things that we're afraid of are the things that end up taking us down, because we operate out of that fear and not out of trusting God to see us through this situation. We see that he was afraid of the people. In one particular situation, where he was afraid of the people, it ultimately ended up saving Jonathan. He had presented an oath. Anybody that ate food that during this time was going to be put to death. And Jonathan, after a battle, was hungry, and his men were hungry. And Jonathan had not heard that order from his father and ate some honey. And ultimately, Saul had to make the decision to put Jonathan to death. And the people said, no, let's not do that. Now, I find this interesting that not only did Saul not do it because he was afraid of the people, but what I find more fascinating about this is that the people rallied behind Jonathan and not behind Saul. What we see is that Jonathan acted. He would go out and do things. Now, you might say, well, does that show his patience or lack of patience? No, that's actually not the situation at all. Jonathan even went up with his armor bearer, and they said, look, we're going to ask this question, and if God wants us to attack, he's going to say this, and if he doesn't want him to attack, he's going to say this. And so therefore, he actually presented it before God, and when God basically gave him the permission to go ahead and attack the Philistines, Jonathan did so. And when Jonathan attacked the Philistines and started to rout them, people came out from the caves. Some of those 3,000 people that were hiding came out and rallied behind Jonathan. We see that people will respond to people and leaders that aren't afraid. One of the biggest examples of failure that I see in more recent history is that of President Nixon. We talked about President Nixon and his deception of Watergate, but that was after the Watergate was uncovered, after a security guard found the tape on the door and caught the break-in for it, and everything just kind of snowballed from there, and Nixon tried to cover it up. However, the reason for Watergate and for many other of the decisions he had was because of Nixon's fear. Nixon was afraid of everybody. His fear was even so bad that he even had people investigate the Kennedys, even JFK, who was already assassinated almost a decade before. But because of Nixon's fear of it and his paranoia of what was going to take place and how he might lose out and be looked upon poorly, that's part of what happened. Ultimately, because of this, President Nixon had to resign from his presidency. But I want to read a few quotes from Nixon so you can kind of get a full grasp of how his fear impacted some of the ways that he worked. Nixon was fearful of people who he considered intellectuals. I think part of that came from his background. He was more or less just kind of a hard worker. He did not see himself as an intellectual of an Ivy League person. He's even been said as saying, remember that an intellectual is tempted to put himself above the law. He even said the Jewish are born spies, with an arrogance that says that's what makes a spy. He puts himself above the law. Nixon was very paranoid about that. Never forget the press is the enemy. Then it says the establishment establishment is the enemy. The professors are the enemy. He even said, write that on the blackboard 100 times, that professors are the enemy. When the Pentagon Papers came out, he was so paranoid about what other people were going to say, that he was secretly taping things, which again ultimately led to his failure, just like what ended up happening with Saul. Another example of someone who did not lead with that type of fear is David. During that time when everybody was afraid of Goliath, David's like, no, I have God. I don't need to be afraid because I trust in God. And David went down and routed Goliath and killed him, with the stone. And most people know that story. But what's again the amazing part about it is once that happened, they routed the Philistines. They chased them out of the valley. They were able to overwhelmingly conquer the Philistines, even though they were larger and even though they had more people. They were able to do so. God was on their side and all of that, and God would have found some way of killing them if they didn't come. But you see that people were wanting to see a leader that was not afraid. And as a result, people grew more and more fond of David, which made Saul more and more afraid of David, which ultimately led to him chasing David and trying to kill David throughout much part of David's life.